The labyrinth of tunnels underneath the streets of London are bustling with life during the day, but when it gets late and you're the only soul left on the platform, something else may make its presence known. And the Central Line, being the longest underground line in London, has plenty of shadows and forgotten corners of stations for otherworldly entities to lurk. Disembodied screams echo through stations scarred by World War II tragedy. Grieving spectres are glimpsed, unable to move on until they find who they're looking for. Mysterious figures are caught on CCTV, even when you think you're alone in the station. Some stories have been told for decades, others are whispered only among graveyard shift staff and the bravest late-night travellers. So mind the gap, because we're going through the history and the hauntings, station by haunted station on the Central Line. Will you tag along with me, or would you rather not know what may be watching you from the shadows during your commute? So back in the 19th century, the streets of London were getting more and more congested as the population continued to grow. They needed a solution to help ease the traffic on the roads, and as I think we still are even now a fair bit away from those Futurama-style tunnels, they only had one realistic option when it came down to it: to go underground. The first line, the Metropolitan Railway, opened in 1863, becoming officially the world's first underground railway system. And after that roaring success, it was basically the green light to build more and more tunnels underneath the streets of London. They'd proven the concept, yeah, there were teething issues obviously, but they could see the potential in this. But today we're going to be focusing on the Central Line, originally known as the Central London Railway, which first opened in 1900 and ran from Shepherd's Bush to the Bank of England. It was nicknamed the Twopenny Tube because it charged a flat rate of 2p to travel between any two stations on the line. But as you can imagine with its official name, it does travel through a very central part of London too. Very old, very densely populated, and so very connected with death, as you're about to see. From fatal hits during the Blitz to disturbing long dead remains during the Central Line's construction and expansions, it's not hard to see why the Central Line is said to be home to more than a couple of ghost stories. If you know a train operator working in the London Underground, maybe ask them if they've ever experienced anything a bit weird. It's not uncommon for tube drivers to see figures in the tunnels ahead of them, or get the feeling like you're being watched as you pass through the very aptly named ghost stations, platforms that haven't seen a commuter in decades. Not every station has a ghost story attached to it though, and to be honest I feel like that's a good thing. Might feel a little bit forced if every single one was a Halloween attraction. But the first haunted stop we come to as part of the original Central London Railway line is Marble Arch. And this station, it's pretty significant in London's dark history anyway, because it sits right next to the site of the Tyburn Gallows. This was London's top execution spot for hundreds of years between 1196 and 1783, the final stop for over 50,000 people that were executed here. Because you know, if you weren't posh enough to be executed in the Tower of London, or even Tower Hill, a place that we have actually already covered before, they needed a gallows for all the commoners like you and me. And Tyburn, you could say, got a fair bit of use. Understatement of the year, crowds would gather to watch public executions where up to 24 condemned would be executed all at once. And with that sheer number of people executed, that is a lot of bodies to get rid of. Some were cut down and taken away for medical dissection by surgeons, but a lot were just dumped in unmarked graves nearby, including possibly Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland and Ireland, who took control after King Charles I was overthrown and executed. Yeah, some people believe that his body has actually been buried in this area, although we don't really know for sure. Not that his life ended at Tyburn though. Oliver Cromwell had actually died in 1658 from illness, but then in 1661 he was exhumed from his resting place in Westminster Abbey, where his remains were then hanged before his head was cut off and displayed on the roof of Westminster Hall. I think King Charles II, he had some things he needed to work through when he came to the throne and out of his exile, and had some things to get off his chest. Very strong feelings about what had happened to his dad because of Cromwell and a bunch of his mates when they'd won the English Civil War, maybe? But while the gallows at Tyburn aren't standing anymore, there is a plaque for where it stood for centuries, and it's within spitting distance of Marble Arch Station. And so that's why some people believe that the souls of the condemned, who may have been buried right on the site of the station, are still hanging around. But unfortunately, that is not the only connection with death that Marble Arch has, because this station, like so many across the capital, would become vital to Londoners through World War II, and more specifically during the Blitz, a terrifying bombing campaign that Nazi Germany carried out. And I mean, you've got all of these underground tube stations all throughout the city. It seems like a brilliant solution really, somewhere geared up for the public to access easily so that they can escape the bombing above ground. Well, initially initially, the government didn't want people sheltering in the tube. Quite rightly, they had some pretty valid concerns, really. They were worried about all of these people packed in really tightly in cramped conditions. The spread of disease was going to be a very real threat. And then, of course, you've got the fact that these underground stations are just not specifically designed bomb shelters. They're designed for people to catch a train and move on to the next station, not hunker down for the night. So worries about people tripping over the tracks, tripping over each other was, again, another thing to keep in mind. But then also, looking at it from a morale point of view, during the Blitz, that time in 1940, 1941, that was a super scary time to live in London. And so they were worried that if they gave the green light for people to use these underground stations as communal bomb shelters, that it would just invite terrified citizens to never leave the safety of the underground again. Which is totally valid. I think I would be tempted to become a mole person if there were bombs being dropped on my street, you know? I see where they're coming from. But eventually they did open up some of the deeper level tube stations to be used to shelter from the bombs overnight. And yeah, people who spent the night in the underground, they vividly remembered catching just about everything going. Head lice, scabies, just all of it. It wasn't the most pleasant night's sleep. The place was cold, it was damp, it was smelly. But despite that, the camaraderie was high. People would share their evening meals, have a laugh and a joke, like all of this. Because the bombs may be dropping outside, but you felt a heck of a lot safer down there than above ground. But while sheltering in the tube stations gave you that impression of safety, they definitely weren't without their risks. On the 17th of September 1940, a bomb hit Marble Arch Station directly, killing 20 civilians who were sheltering there overnight. The blast had been so fierce that it had ripped the white tiles off the walls, you know, the ones that like lined the platform, and just turned them into shrapnel. And so maybe it was one of these casualties from that night that continues to hang around the station now. Because we don't know specifically who this entity is, but he's described as being a very creepy, very menacing man. He seems to take great delight in following people, especially women, up the escalator. But no concept of personal space, this guy stands right up behind you. You would be able to feel him breathing down your neck if ghosts had working respiratory systems. And you can just catch a glimpse of him in the corner of your eye, so you definitely know that he's there, just like a woman in 1973 did. She was on the escalator, heading up late at night, when she felt this super uncomfortable presence right behind her. She turned a little bit to look in her peripheral vision, like you're not just going to full on turn and stare back at him. And she said that when she did that, he looked to be a very well-dressed man in a trilby hat and an expensive overcoat. At that point though, she just turned back and stared straight ahead. Did not like the vibe that this guy was giving off, and just walked to get off the escalator. But you know, curiosity and all of that, you just want to get a good look at the guy who just creeped you out. And so she turned back around to get a look at the guy who had definitely just made her super uncomfortable. But when she turned to look at the escalator where he should still be, there was no one there. Nowhere this guy could have ducked out of sight after the escalator, nowhere for him to have gone. He'd just vanished into thin air. And even if you don't see a well-dressed creep stalking you on the escalators, some staff members and late-night commuters claim that Marble Arch definitely has a strange energy to it at times, with disembodied cries or even a quote evil presence felt, with some connecting it to the fact that it's so close to Tyburn Gallows and where tens of thousands of people were killed and buried. And so with a history like that tied to the location, you can see why, can't you? But for now, we're heading a few stops along the Central Line, passing through an actual ghost station, the British Museum, which quite rightly does have its own ghost story. And it's a story that may have relocated when the station was closed in 1933. And we'll be going more into the full story behind the British Museum when I do a video on the haunted stations that are closed down, the ones that aren't actually in use anymore, because the British Museum station, alongside a lot of other ghost stations, they have a story and a half. But basically, the gist of what you need to know for this episode is that when the British Museum were displaying a wooden inner coffin board, the part that sits inside a sarcophagus in an ancient Egyptian burial, there was talk down in the tube station that a ghostly woman wearing an Egyptian headdress and linens had been spotted. And so we will get all into more of her story, who she's said to be, the connection to the Titanic, because yeah, there's apparently one of those in another episode in this series. But for the purposes of this episode, that's all you need to know for now. But when the British Museum tube station closed and the Central Line platform opened up at Holborn in 1933, paranormal reports of an Egyptian woman started coming from here instead. Staff and passengers would claim to see the figure of this woman standing on the platform at Holborn, with some saying that sometimes she can be seen boarding the last train at night. Other times she's not seen, but a female's screams can be heard coming from the tunnels leading towards the old British Museum station, again thought to be her. But some believe that she's not just this apparition, this entity hanging out down in the tunnels, because there was a story about something that supposedly went down in 1935. It just so happened to be the opening night for a film called Bulldog Jack, a comedy set right inside the British Museum and the London Underground. But in the real world, 2 women apparently disappeared from the platform at Holborn Station. After that, the disembodied female screams and eyewitness reports of the ancient Egyptian skyrocketed in the days following these disappearances. And then some say that weird scratch marks appeared on the walls of Holborn, but the 2 women never seen again. Neither hide nor hair, nothing. And since the story came to light, people think that the 2 things are connected, that perhaps the ghost had something to do with the disappearances. Maybe she was angry that the museum's Egyptian room had been referenced in the movie Bulldog Jack, and that a fake tunnel maybe had been talked about in the film connecting the London Underground right to the Egyptian room. I don't know, I'm just trying to speculate on some reasonings why they're connected. But we don't even know who these 2 women were who supposedly went missing. We have no names, no newspaper reports, nothing. It really is just kind of a little bit of an urban legend that gets lumped in with the fact that people say that the Egyptian ghost had hopped stations and was responsible. Okay, so this might just be me being a little cynical here, but does anyone else feel like maybe it was just too good of a ghost story to just disappear with the closure of the British Museum station? And so then people were like, yeah, she's definitely moved down the tracks now that the Central Line is connected to Holborn. I don't know, it was just super hot and sticky while I was researching this one. We're still enduring the heat wave. I'm trying to heal 2 massive tattoos. I was getting a little bit ratty and maybe a bit too cynical. But let me know what you think, because it just seems really weird that this ghost has moved now that the station is closed. Maybe she just needs an audience and all the commuters left that station, so that's why she went to Holborn. I don't know. But if we travel out of Holborn, there's another ghost story that's definitely worth a mention before we even get to the next platform. And if you've ever been on the tube at this point, I don't know, it might be different now because it was a while ago, but maybe the driver will go extra slow along this stretch before you reach Chancery Lane, and there may be a paranormal reason. This story first started in the 60s and 70s, but apparently a lot of drivers would hate getting caught up by the signals in this tunnel, because if they did have to stop at a red signal, they would suddenly get the intense feeling like they were not alone in their cabs anymore. They'd only have the light from the carriages behind them, just kind of sort of illuminating their cab, but even in that dim glow, they would look over and see the indistinct, shadowy figure of a person standing just a couple of feet away from them inside their cab, staring straight out the front window. This figure never said anything, never did anything, never interacted with the drivers or anything like that. They just stood there until as soon as the signal changed and the train moved off again, they would disappear. And so eventually, to avoid having this incredibly unsettling encounter, some drivers took to creeping through that tunnel just so they wouldn't have to stop at the signal. But if you get through that section unscathed and we carry on to the next stop after Chancery Lane, we reach St. Paul's, named so because it sits alongside the famous cathedral. And St. Paul's itself doesn't have a specific ghost to look out for, although, I mean, if you've experienced anything there and you know I want to hear all about it. But there was one story connected to the station, completely unverified, from what I can tell has never happened again, but still creepy nonetheless. And as well, rather than being a late night last train home, maybe you're seeing things because you're a bit tired kind of deal, this encounter happened on an early train, and it happened to one man in particular. He said that for several consecutive days, as he was travelling into St. Paul's station on the early train, I don't know if he was coming from the Chancery Lane side or the bank side, but he noticed a young girl with long black hair sitting directly opposite him. First time you notice her, you think, oh well, she's probably just catching a nap before that Monday morning meeting. Although, I will never understand how people can nap on public transport. I did it once on a train out to Chelmsford and then panicked for the rest of the journey that I'd missed my stop. So initially that was that, but then day after day, she was there, again, sitting opposite him. Her head would be drooped down, so all of her hair covered her face, proper The Ring style, and that would be it. Until the last day that this guy saw the girl. This time, it was different. She was still sitting opposite him, but instead of having her head down, she was staring directly at him. He claimed that her eyes were hollow and her features were all twisted and grey, which just sounds absolutely terrifying, to be honest. But after that day, he got off the train, thought to himself that was incredibly weird, but that was it. He never saw the girl again. Like I say, we don't know who that guy was. No one else has come forward claiming to experience anything like that. Maybe it was just a tourist having a really rough time on holiday. Either way, it gets talked about as a bit of a creepypasta connected to St. Paul's Station. But a station that's got a little bit more historical record for the ghosts to go off is the next station along, Bank, named after the Bank of England, which sits not too far away. And Bank Station is the last of the original underground stations that were opened in 1900. That was as east as central London Railway could get you. But, I mean, it's still properly in the middle of things, and I guess that you could say London is a pretty old town. There were already things in the way before the station was built, including churchyards, and by extension of that, bodies buried in said churchyards. During construction of the station, Londoners who had been buried in the churchyard of St Mary Woolnoth had to be moved and reinterred about an hour away in Ilford. And so what used to be the crypt for the church, the final, eternal, sacred resting place for the long dead, that's now the ticket hall for Bank Station. And so that's probably enough to stir up restless souls and whatnot, right? But we are far from done here though. During the Blitz, Bank Station suffered a devastating direct hit from a bomb on the 11th of January 1941, which killed 56 people who were sheltering down there. And just looking at the photos of the aftermath with all the twisting metal and just the gaping hole in the road above, knowing that people had been buried underneath, is just brutal to look at. You can only imagine the recovery efforts after something like that. And it seems like there are echoes of that night replaying in Bank Station, as people claim to hear muffled screams and cries for help. But if you try and investigate where it came from, the sounds disappear. Cleaning staff working down there late at night sometimes report hearing an actual explosion or the cries of a small child. But again, no idea where those sounds have come from. And especially as the station had closed for the night, there certainly shouldn't be any children down there. And it also definitely shouldn't come with the unmistakable sensation that something unseen is watching you very closely. And there is a pretty famous story which first appeared in a documentary around the ghosts of the London Underground, where in 1982, a staff member who was working late, past closing, heard a relentless knocking sound coming from the closed, out of service lift. Of course, your first reaction is, obviously there must be someone stuck in there. No idea how they got in there in the first place, but that's something that you can figure out once they're out safe. So they opened up the lift to find that there was absolutely no one in there. I'm gonna guess that this guy was used to working in the station late at night, used to the normal sounds of the underground, and so it didn't sound like metal contracting or anything like that. But even so, after finding out that there was no one in the lift, he went back towards the ticket hall to just brush it off and carry on. As he was walking away, a door slammed right by him. And his reaction? Not today. Don't want to deal with this today. Which is, yeah, that's a totally fair, valid reaction to have. But even if you don't hear something out of the ordinary, some commuters say that Bank sometimes has a very distinctive atmosphere to it. People say that you can just feel absolutely overcome with helplessness and sadness. And it's got nothing to do with the fact that you're about to get on a central train line in rush hour. Electronics can sometimes malfunction down here, lights will flicker, and shadowy figures have apparently been picked up on CCTV. But when security go to check, there's not a soul around. But while all that could be seen as rather unsettling, definitely wouldn't catch me keeping calm and carrying on if any of that happened to me late at night in an underground station. Bank is a bit infamous for a particular ghost story that's actually connected with the Bank of England and predates the station itself. And this female entity, she is known as the Black Nun. But in a little twist for this particular ghost, she isn't actually a nun. She's just glimpsed in and around Bank Station wearing a black dress, and that's why she got her nickname? Maybe because her dress looks like a nun's habit? But I don't know, apparently it's just a normal Victorian morning dress, so I don't know. But anyway, her story goes that she was a 19-year-old woman called Sarah Whitehead, who was living in London in the early 19th century, and she had a brother called Paul, who she was very, very close to. Paul had a job as a clerk at the Bank of England, but he also seemed to live this lifestyle that was way above his pay grade. Really did enjoy the finer things in life. Thing about living beyond your means, though, is that eventually your means run out. But Paul, he worked at the bank. Surely with all of his financial knowledge, he could help himself out of his predicament, right? He started investing in the stock market, hoping to make a quick quid or two, but I think that must have been a no-no for his employers, and so he was actually quietly encouraged to resign from his position at the Bank of England. That's not going to help fund that lifestyle, but it got even worse. In his desperation, Paul turned to more underhanded means to make his money, but it all blew up in his face when he was found out for forging documents at another bank to get his hands on some cash. When it all came out, Paul was arrested, found guilty, and executed on the 29th of January 1812. All throughout this drama though, Sarah, she was happy-go-lucky. She had no idea anything was going on because she was kept sheltered from it all. Her family knew that her mental health wasn't the best and she probably wouldn't be able to cope if she knew what had really happened. England. And so she was kept in the dark. She didn't have a clue what was going on with her brother, none the wiser that anything was wrong at all. But that didn't change the fact that she was still close with him, and now he just wasn't around anymore. And no one would tell her why. She just didn't understand it, and so she took to visiting the Bank of England, the last place that she'd known her brother had worked, trying to catch him. She would ask every day, "Is my brother in? Can I see him?" I think the other employees at the bank must have known that Sarah's mental health wasn't great, and so they kept the ruse going, like, "Oh, sorry Sarah, he's not in today," and things like that. Eventually though, Sarah came into the bank and asked a clerk who wasn't in on this pretense, and they were like, "Well, he's dead, isn't he?" At that point, the ground just crumbled underneath Sarah when she learned what had truly happened to her beloved brother. And yeah, she couldn't cope with the news at all. Her mind refused to accept the reality, and so after that day, and for every single day for the rest of her life, Sarah kept visiting the Bank of England, wearing a black mourning dress and asking to see her brother, asking to see Paul. It's said that she died in her mid to late 40s, but apparently that didn't stop her from continuing to look for her brother. Her apparition has been seen with a very sorrowful look on her face, walking around the Bank of England itself and out on Threadneedle Street, the road outside. When Bank Station was being built in the late 19th century, workers claimed that she was down there too. This pale-faced woman, sometimes crying and with an overwhelming feel of sadness around her. Sometimes she was accompanied by a pretty bad smell too, something like decaying bodies or stagnant water, which is a bit unusual for stories like this. Usually it's perfume or roses that you can smell. But Sarah's story, it's a really famous one around London really, not just the underground. It was big enough to inspire a stage play in 1861. It's been referenced in poems, in penny fictions, like all of these things. And while Paul Whitehead was a real person, his trial transcript can be found through the Old Bailey. We don't have a record for Sarah Whitehead, his sister. And to be fair, like even Paul, he's usually referred to as Philip when you see his story online. Whether that was his actual name, whether that name came from one of the poems or plays or what have you afterwards, it's just something worth pointing out. I went with the name Paul because that was on the Old Bailey transcript, you know? Even with that though, that hasn't stopped sightings of the Black Nun of Bank Station. One staff member in the 1970s saw the figure and went to chase after her, thinking that an older woman had been locked in the station overnight, only she completely vanished before he could catch up to her, with nowhere that she could have gone. And then in 2001, a commuter watched as a woman wearing a black dress quietly walked along the platform before disappearing through a wall. That's gonna be something that you remember for a while afterwards. But while Bank Station has a pretty famous ghost story attached to it, if we head further east along the Central Line, we'll get to the next stop, Liverpool Street. Often called one of the most haunted underground stations in the entire city. And so Liverpool Street, it wasn't obviously originally on the Central Line. It was opened in 1875 to serve the Metropolitan Railway, now the Metropolitan Line. But in 1912, with the expansion of the Central Line, a new platform was opened at Liverpool Street. But the history on this site goes back way further than even that. Because back in the 13th century, obviously London wasn't nearly as big as it is now, there was a priory that sat here on the outskirts of town. And this priory of St. Mary Bethlehem also had an infirmary attached to it, where they would care for sick patients. At some point in the 14th century, possibly around 1377, the hospital was caring for mentally ill patients, who were actually called inmates at the time. And this quote-unquote, I use the term very loosely here, mental health care, would eventually become what the place was known for. Because in case you didn't know, the priory of the New Order of Our Lady of Bethlehem, as it was officially and initially known, eventually earned the nickname Bedlam. Yeah, that one. The infamous institution, notorious for its horrific conditions, brutal treatments, and tragically high patient death rate. Where again, you've got a lot of bodies to dispose of, so mass graves around the site were the solution. And just to give you an idea of the standard of care, in the 19th century you could literally pay money to watch the patients, as if they were in a type of travelling freak show or something. The hospital was eventually moved away from the original site in the 1600s though, but there may have been some people, or at least some energy, left behind if the stories are to be believed. And the tragedies didn't end with Bedlam moving away either. During the First World War this time, not the Second, the area was hit by air raids as well. In 1317, 3 bombs were dropped on Liverpool Street Station, with 2 of them exploding and resulting in the deaths of 16 people. More recently though, and I'm actually old enough to remember this one being all over the news, was the 7th of July 2005 London terror attacks. One of the 4 suicide bombers that day targeted a train that had departed from Liverpool Street and was heading towards Aldgate on the Circle line. 7 innocent people lost their lives on that train, and the suicide bomber's miserable existence ended there too. So I can absolutely imagine, especially if you were in London at the time the attacks happened, the weight of what happened there, that's gonna stay for a long time. Even the other attacks though that day, just going off on a bit of a tangent, but what one of those bombers did to that bus, geez, like that image is just burned into my memory. All of that energy though at Liverpool Street Station, that trauma on top of the World War I tragedy, and then the old mass graves from Bedlam, that's a lot. In 2013, excavations started again around the station, and they discovered thousands of buried remains in one of those mass graves, thought to be comprised of plague victims, prisoners, and then just unclaimed bodies. Just all of these people trying to rest in eternity while you're out on your morning commute right next to them. Some of the remains showed signs of beatings and starvation, just to really drive home what life would have been like if you had found yourself at Bedlam, which is where the first ghost story at Liverpool Street is said to have originated from. This female entity is supposedly a former patient at the hospital. Now I'm not sure how we know this information, but apparently her name is Rebecca Griffiths, who was a young woman held at Bedlam in the late 18th, early 19th century, where she unfortunately died. What is interesting though, before we get into her story, is that she was a patient of the hospital after it had moved away from where Liverpool Street Station is now, but yet her ghost is said to haunt this area, so yeah, I don't know. But her story goes that all while she was kept at the asylum, she would obsessively hold on to this coin. It was her coin, nobody was going to take it off her, she never let it out of her sight. After she passed away, as like a little nod to her, her coin was left in her hand, ready for it to be buried with her, so that then she would still have it in death. Until allegedly along came a not very nice staff member who decided that there was no use burying a perfectly good coin, and so he took it off her. You can see where this ghost story is going, can't you? But now, staff members working in the station late at night can hear a female's screams echoing through the tunnels, although when they go to check, like stations before, there's never anyone there. Some people claim that as they're about to get on the train, a pale-faced woman wearing a tattered dress will claw at them, trying to grab on, before just vanishing into thin air. And that is just, that's quite a lot, isn't it? That's really going to leave you questioning whether you're still drunk from the night before or something, surely. And I don't think we've got solid records of Rebecca Griffith's life, but people who tell a ghost story like to point out that a coin was found during the excavations into the mass burial ground. And so they connect it in the way of like, oh, Rebecca's coin has been found, maybe she'll be at peace now, or maybe she'll be trying extra hard to get to it now she knows where it is. But I just want to say, I'm just stepping back a second. It's a brilliant ghost story, having an entity clutching onto commuters. You don't hear that very often. Very creepy, 10 out of 10. Put it in a horror movie immediately. But the details of this one are a little messy. The connection's a little tenuous, if you'll indulge me. First of all, obviously, as I've mentioned, if she was at Bedlam in the 18th century, that's well past the time that the hospital was on this site, and by extension of that, the churchyard for the place that would be used to bury the patients. So then why would she return here? Second of all, the whole coin thing. Okay, very cool that a coin was found during the excavations, but it was thought to date back to the 15th century, and it was more of like a decorative coin, like a sequin or a pendant. But then also, why would it have been buried in the old churchyard of Bedlam that, again, had moved away by that point, if it was actually stolen by a hospital worker? I don't know. The details just don't quite add up to me for this one. I feel like I'm being really critical of the stories today, but it's not to say that Rebecca Griffiths isn't actually haunting the station, or even a different female entity from the time of the asylum being here. Maybe we just don't know the backstory. But they're just the details and the way that the story is told. It's just things to keep in mind, you know? Just consider that my pinch of salt. But other than Rebecca, Liverpool Street Station does seem to have weird things going on. Staff members will claim to hear faint laughter or crying, or even footsteps following behind them. One cleaner once heard these footsteps following right behind her. Absolutely booming sounds. So she stopped, and so did the footsteps. She turned around, but there was no one there. And some believe that this activity is due to the people who were buried here for centuries before their resting place was disturbed, as the really strong smell of damp earth and rotting meat has been experienced. Whether that's just because the cleaner had decided that the ghostly footsteps were too much and she just walked out mid-shift, who knows? But that wasn't the only weirdness keeping the station staff on their toes. Back in 2000, and try not to think of that as 25 years ago, that hit me like a ton of bricks, the station was closed. It was 2 a.m. when a service controller, basically like an air traffic controller but the underground, he noticed on CCTV that there was a guy wearing white maintenance overalls and carrying a tool bag walking around the station. Definitely shouldn't be anyone about. The station is closed. There isn't any scheduled maintenance works being done or anything like that. And so he radioed to the station's supervisor, a guy called Steve Coates, who went to check on the platform to find out who on earth this person was. He got down to where the CCTV had most definitely picked up on this guy to find absolutely no one around. Not even any sign that anyone had been there. So he radioed back up to the office saying to the effect of, "Coast is clear, there's no one here." But the controller, who was back in the office, said, "Nope, he's definitely there, I can see him on my screen." So again, Steve went, had another look around. "Mate, you're mistaken, there is no one here." Again, just back and forth. There is simply no way that you cannot see this guy because I can see he's standing right next to you. Very unnerving for someone to say that to you. I think I'd rather not know, just tell me after the fact. Anyway, Steve, being much more level-headed than I could ever hope to be, he gave the platform one last look over and he spotted something on the bench. A pair of white overalls, folded up neatly. No idea where they'd come from. I'm gonna guess he hadn't noticed them in the initial look-throughs or anything, but that story, I could not cope if that was me. Although, because it didn't happen to me, I'm just curious about it, and I don't think the CCTV was ever released. I would have loved to have seen what it would have looked like from the controller's point of view. That would have been very interesting. But leaving Liverpool Street Station now and moving further east along the Central Line again, and the next stop we get to, Bethnal Green. Oof. Get ready, this one has a really sad story. The station was first built during the New Works programme, a massive upgrade and expansion scheme carried out between 1935 and 1940, which included plans to extend the Central Line further out towards Epping Forest. Shameless plug, but that place, Epping Forest, super haunted, and I went and filmed a special episode there with my wonderful editor, Eulogy Media, so you should definitely check that one out if you haven't already. But this was during the time of the Second World War, and because the yet-to-be completed Bethnal Green station was deeper underground, it was actually requisitioned to be used as an air raid shelter. Oh man, brace yourselves. It was kitted out with thousands of bunk beds ready to keep the terrified citizens of London safe when the air raid siren sounded at about 17 minutes past 8 on the 3rd of March 1943. Hundreds of people flocked to the entrance of Bethnal Green and began to descend the stairs into the safety of the station. But here's where it all went wrong. It had been raining that day, and so the stairs were pretty slippery and there were no handrails for anyone to grab onto. So you've got that massive hazard on a normal day. Second, there was the constant threat of German bombers flying over the capital city. You can't just have lights illuminating your path and spotlighting a massive target all over you, so it was dark too. But then third, on this night in particular, there was mass panic, and it was caused by the sounds of explosions. People living in London at this time, they knew what the bombs sounded like. These sounds, they were different explosions to usual. They didn't sound like any bombs that they had heard before. And so it was scary, and people were pushing to get into the station as quickly as possible, thinking that the Germans were unleashing a new kind of weapon on London. A woman in the crowd, who was carrying a bundle of bedding and had a baby with her, slipped on the 3rd step up from the bottom and fell over. This caused the elderly man behind her to fall over her, and on it went, like dominoes. People further back pushing into people in front to get to safety, but those people toppling over, struggling to breathe, getting crushed, trampled at the bottom of the stairs. That night, 173 people died in the crush at Bethnal Green. Most of them were women and children and had died from asphyxiation. You just cannot even comprehend, can you, the sheer panic, the powerlessness from having this huge mass of people all around you. There are explosions going off nearby in the dark and you don't know what they are. You just want to get to safety, but you're not in control of where you're moving in that moment. Just awful. When I was at Download Festival a couple of weeks weeks ago, they actually had to stop Steel Panther's set midway through as there was a crush forming. So it is scary. But if you ever find yourself in that situation, this is my little PSA, because what an unimaginable death. Please, if you ever find yourself in a crowd crush, your main objective is to stay upright. Just try and stay on your feet. I know it sounds ridiculous and like obviously common sense, but the best way that you can do that is to just move with the crowd. Just lean into it and just move with the crowd. Don't try and fight against it. And you have to prioritize putting your arms up on your chest so that you can force just a little bit of personal space so that you can continue to breathe. So your ribs have the space to expand and your lungs can get air in. It's the main reason that I actually usually hang back at a gig or festival nowadays. I'd prefer just a little space around me, thanks. But at Bethnal Green, the news of the disaster didn't break for 36 hours thanks to wartime reporting rules. And even then, much of the story was kept quiet. It wasn't until the findings of the official investigation were made public in 1946 that the true details of what happened finally all came to light. Those explosions that had scared everyone hadn't been German bombs. Over in Victoria Park, about 10 minutes away, the army had been testing new anti-aircraft rockets, and that's what they'd heard. The report concluded that the disaster was caused by panic, made worse by less than ideal conditions getting into the station, and the lack of supervision by the ARP, basically air raid wardens. That night at Bethnal Green Station was the deadliest civilian disaster on the British home front throughout World War II, even though no bombs were dropped, no enemy planes were even recorded in that part of the city that night. Just the devastation. After the Second World War though, in 1946, Bethnal Green Station opened up properly as part of the Central Line, although a lot of the ghost stories seem to centre around its darkest moment, perhaps unsurprisingly. There's a famous account from back in the 80s when a foreman called John Graham was working late at night. All of a sudden, he just started hearing a kid crying. Before he even had time to decipher where it was coming from, the crying started to be accompanied by a woman screaming. The noises were getting louder and louder, and more voices were adding into this cacophony. More terrified screams, more crying, more shouts and pleas for help. John was whipping around looking all around him, but he couldn't see a single thing out of place, only this deafening noise of a crowd in sheer blind panic. He claimed that this noise went on for 10 to 15 minutes, which is a ridiculously long stretch of time when you're terrified out of your skin, before he just couldn't take it anymore and he ran from the station. But now, apparently other staff members have also heard this horrible sound, seeming to be most common late at night and around the entrance to the station where the disaster occurred. Some people, commuters passing through, have reported strange sensations too, like the feeling that they're either suffocating even though there's no one around them. One person said that they felt someone grab their ankle, as if a person behind them had fallen over and needed help. And then one time, a commuter claimed that someone whispered help right in their ear, although when they turned around, completely alone. Ooh, that one's a bit creepy. Figures have also been seen at Bethnal Green too, when a woman saw a little boy who was standing all alone on the platform in absolute floods of tears. She obviously wanted to help, to try and comfort the boy, like, where are your parents? But when she approached him and tried to reach out to him, he vanished in front of her eyes. A little girl has also been seen being a little bit more unsettling. She's been witnessed wearing a white dress and giggling to herself, which, I mean, a bit nicer than crying, but she has no eyes. Just black sockets, where the eyes should have been. No thank you, little girl. But we don't know who she is, why she's giggling, where her eyes have gone, anything like that. So maybe, depending on how much you fancy coming face to face with her, you might want to carry on along the Central Line to the next stop instead. So if you're ever the last person waiting on the Central Line, just remember that you might have company that you can't see, but the controller on the CCTV can. So remember to mind the gap, and the ghosts. But have you ever had your own paranormal experience on the London Underground that you couldn't explain? Being completely honest, and probably a little bit naive, I never really thought of the Underground as being so haunted, but yeah, I mean, most of London is apparently haunted, so it makes sense that the ghosts are not just on the surface. Some skeptics have attempted to explain away the phenomenon experienced down in the stations though. Infrasound in the tunnels causing weird feelings, noises echoing in weird ways, maybe even like screams and laughter being heard coming from street level or something like that. And I mean, absolutely, yeah, I get weird feelings when I'm on the tube, but I'm a nervous Nelly, so my brain will be on overdrive anyway. Although those explanations, they don't really solve the ghostly figures disappearing right in front of you or getting grabbed on your ankle by something you can't see. I do absolutely believe that the Underground is haunted though. There is a lot of history and a lot of tragedy that has happened at a lot of these stations, not even getting into the deaths that occur on London Underground with alarming regularity, people falling or jumping onto the tracks and things like that. So I definitely can see it from that point of view. Absolutely all of the stations on the Central Line that we've chatted about being haunted, maybe not so much. Some of the stories do seem a little bit far-fetched for me. Like I've said, the Egyptian woman moving from one station to another because her original one shut down, like things like that. But then what I found with this one were, with others, some of them were really hard to differentiate, as a lot of the same phenomena has been experienced in multiple stations all over London, not just on the Central Line. I know that multiple stations suffered tragedies during World War II, but that doesn't make each one any less devastating for the people involved and the amount of energy being imprinted on a place, you know? But let me know your thoughts, your opinions, your experiences if you have them. I love reading all of your ghost stories. And I also, just before I go, I want to give a huge shout out to anyone who went and rewatched my last upload all about the ghosts of Chillingham Castle. There was a technical issue on YouTube side, and so the premiere played absolutely perfectly, but the regular video afterwards was just completely unwatchable, which was super awesome cool. But I'd worked really hard on that one, which I know is always the way when that's when something's gonna go wrong, when you've put a lot of time and effort into it, and so had the wonderful Eulogy Media, who is my editor. So it really did mean the absolute world to me that some of you wonderful people went back and rewatched the upload, so thank you so much. But if you enjoyed this, please do give the video a like and let me know which line you want me to cover next. I hear that the Piccadilly line has some very interesting stations on it, but happy to take requests. And if this is the first that you're seeing of me, or even if it's not and you aren't already subscribed, it would be super cool if you did subscribe to my channel. But anyway, that is all from me today. Go grab a drink of water. You definitely do not want to get on the London Underground without a bottle of water with you, especially during this warm weather. Stay hydrated, please. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. He was exhumed from his resting place in Westminster Abbey. Exhumed from his resting place in Why is that so difficult? He was exhumed from his resting place in Westminster Abbey. You do it fine there.